a brief history of the English education system before 2010. This is the content of the first taught session of this module. Here is your tutor team for the module. I'm Matt Perks, I'm the module lead. My background is in teaching science in secondary schools, then a sixth form college, and then I moved here to the university. Emma Rawlings-Smith has a background teaching secondary geography and has worked at several universities before this one. Tiffany Cawthorne has a background teaching younger children in school and also has experience of other universities before the University of Southampton. This session is about the English education system before 2010. How is this relevant to the changes that have happened since 2010? Well, it is not possible to understand the changes since 2010 unless you have some knowledge of how the education system has developed in England up to that point. Here is a list of the prime ministers since the early 20th century. Blue represents the Conservative Party, which is the more right-leaning main UK political party, and red represents Labour, which is the more left-leaning main UK political party. And you can see in 2010 there was a change in government. 2010 was the end of a long period of Labour administration and the start of a long period of Conservative-led administration. There were some major changes in the way the United Kingdom was governed at that point. And between 2010 and 2014, the Secretary of State, the new Secretary of State for Education, Michael Gove, and the team that he was working within, had some strong views on how the education systems should change, and those changes have continued from that period. Having said that, some of the policies that have shaped the current English education system were initially policies under the Labour administration between 1997 and 2010. So that's why we're talking about the period before 2010, and it's why we're interested in changes since 2010. Why are we talking about the English education system and not the British education system? Well, if you look at the map on the right, there are 4 countries that make up the United Kingdom. England is the largest and has by far the biggest population, but there is also Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Scotland and Northern Ireland have had separate education systems all the time, and Wales has had a system which was very much the same as the English system, but over the last 20 or so years there has been increasing devolution. What does that mean? Well, devolution is passing something on to other people. In this case it means passing responsibility for the education system and a number of other things to the governments of Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales. And the Welsh education system and the English education system have been moving in different directions for a number of years now. So this module is going to focus on the English system, although we will at some points compare with the systems in the other parts of the United Kingdom, as well as comparing with a range of other countries around the world. From the required reading, you should have gained a brief overview of the development of the English education system from its very early beginnings through to the early part of the 20th century. Here are some events from that period. I'm going to ask you to stop the video and see if you can put those in the correct chronological order from the thing that happened first to the thing that happened most recently. Pause the video now and do that. I'll assume that you have done that. Here is the correct chronological order. You don't need to learn this. We have pointed you not only at this brief summary as a required reading, but also at a very detailed and extensive history of the English education system, which is available online. And you can find that in the reading list or the links from this session if you need to refer to it. However, I'd like to make 2 broad points. The first is that the current English education system contains elements of almost everything that went before the current period. There has never been a time when the education system in England has been redesigned from a clean slate. It's never been changed completely. And most of the things that have happened, even going right back to the earliest examples of schools, you can still see within the education system. So that's one general point. The other general point is that things that came into the system a long time ago often still exist in the system but are very different from how they were originally. So if you talk about grammar schools now, you mean schools that are selective in their intake, and we will talk about that again in a moment. But that's not originally what grammar schools were. They were set up in order to teach Latin in particular to certain groups of people. Perhaps the biggest change, and it often is confusing for people that aren't very familiar with the English system, but public schools were originally set up as charities to educate poor boys in the areas where they were established. However, they've changed completely since then, and they are now amongst the most expensive schools in the United Kingdom. They are independent from the government, funded through the fees that the majority of their pupils pay. The most famous example is probably Eton College, which is a school that was attended by Prince William and Prince Harry, amongst a lot of other people, including I think something like 22 Prime Ministers of the United Kingdom. And Winchester College is the closest example to Southampton. Winchester College is the school that was attended by the current Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. Okay, so moving on, this is the period up to the early 20th century. Not very much changed in the period that included the First World War and the Second World War, but there was a massive change in UK government and society at the end of the Second World War. In 1945, a few months before the end of the war, a radical Labour government was elected and made sweeping changes to the way in which many things within the UK operated. For example, they created the National Health Service. So this meant instead of having to pay for medical treatment, it was available to everybody free of cost at the point of delivery. And the National Health Service is still the main way in which healthcare is delivered in the United Kingdom. They introduced national insurance. This was an additional tax. It was specifically designed to pay pensions, unemployment benefit to anybody that lost their job, and sickness benefit to people who were unable to work due to ill health. National insurance is no longer directly tied to those benefits, but it is still a tax that is paid by most employees. Child benefit was a universal benefit paid to the parents of all children between the ages of 0 and 18 years. Again, it still exists. There are some restrictions on who it is paid to, but the majority of parents in the UK get child benefit. After the war, there was an urgent need for additional housing. Some housing had been destroyed in bombing in the Second World War, and there was an expanding population. 80% of new houses built in the period after the Second World War were built by the government as what are known as council houses. So they were available for rent at relatively low cost to more disadvantaged families, families who had less money. As an example, if you go from the Highfield University campus across Burgess Road into the Flowers estate, each of the roads there is named after a flower, then that's an example of a post-war council house estate, although that estate is, the ownership of that estate has changed since that time. Within education, not a great deal changed at this point, despite the massive change in UK government and society, but the participation age, that is the age up to which it is compulsory to go to school, the participation age was raised to 15 in 1944, and then it was raised again later to 16. There was a much more recent raising of the participation age to 18, but that will be picked up in another of the sessions in this module. So what did the education system look like? There were all these changes happening in society, but there weren't big changes in the education system. What did it look like at this point? Well, it was described as a tripartite system in secondary education. So everybody went to the same schools at what is now called Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2. So that's primary education. If you are from an international background or you're reading literature from the United States, that's very similar to the period that's described as elementary education in some other countries, but we call it primary education here in the United Kingdom. Okay, so primary schools were available to everybody, but then there was a tripartite system for secondary education. This is from the age of 11 upwards. So tri is a prefix meaning three, like triangle and tricycle. There were three types of school: secondary modern, technical and grammar school. However, there were hardly any technical schools, so we're going to ignore those and think of this as a system which had two schools in it, two types of schools. At the age of 10 or 11, children sat an 11+ test. Those who got high marks on that test went to grammar schools, and other children went to secondary modern schools. In the period after the Second World War, about 1/3 of children went to grammar schools, and the other 2/3 went to secondary moderns. Now, there are still grammar schools in England, but they are only in a few areas that resisted changes to a comprehensive system. We'll look at that in a moment. In the teaching session, we had a go at some 11+ questions. You can access some examples of those on the Blackboard site. You might find those very difficult, or you might find them very easy. You might wonder about what they are like if you are a 10 or 11-year-old child. Just remember, your experience just now is not a piece of high-quality data. I could use the quote that the plural of anecdote is not data. This is from Kernahan and Kuruvilla, 1982, but it's become quite a famous quote that is used quite regularly. What does it mean? It's suggesting that the experience of one person is not something you should base decisions on. However, we need to think in education that actually quite often we are interested in qualitative data from one or a small number of people. Individual people's experience is of great relevance to us and is very important. But we must remember that one person's experience cannot be extrapolated to the experience of everybody else. And the experience that you have, or that one person has, or that a group of people have, might depend on the particular context in which that occurs. And I'd like to suggest that when you have a go at 11+ questions, that is not a context that represents being a 10 or 11-year-old child, and it does not represent a context where you are perhaps prepared for, ready for, ambitious for a good mark on that test. That is a question that we might want to think about. As other examples, we could try some questions off a Key Stage 2 SATS paper. This is taken at about the same time as 11+, but it's not a selection exam for school entry. It is a school accountability test, really, to try to evaluate learning at the end of Key Stage 2, at the end of primary education, and it's sat by nearly all children in state-maintained schools in England. We might well find there are questions on that paper that we would be unable to answer. And certainly if I gave you a GCSE electronics paper, I'd expect most of you would get very few marks on that paper. And it's because you haven't done the electronics GCSE curriculum, so you don't have the requisite knowledge. Is 11+ like that? Well, if you're interested in how the 11+ exam works and to what extent it is possible to prepare children for it, and whether some children are better prepared than others, then there's extensive literature on that within the debate about selection at age 11. And that's an important debate because we do still have selection in certain areas in England, and there is frequently an argument made that we should have more selection, that the tripartite system that actually only had two types of school in it was a good system, and there are also regularly arguments made that we should get rid of the last bits of selection that we still have in England. So I'm going to briefly present some arguments that are made when people are discussing selection, and I'm going to ask you first of all to think about which of these are arguments for selection and which are arguments against selection. And then I'm going to ask you to think about which you think are the most important arguments. Because what you think about whether or not a school system should have selection in it and at what age selection should take place will depend a lot on what you think the purpose of education is. That will affect whether you think some arguments are more important than others. All our arguments should be based on evidence, but how important we think they are will depend on what we think the purpose of the education system is. So here are the arguments. A, maybe selection to different types of schools makes it even harder for children from disadvantaged, poorer backgrounds to gain high-level academic qualifications and access well-paid professional jobs. B, maybe children from disadvantaged, poorer backgrounds who do well on the 11+ test and go to grammar schools are more likely to gain high-level academic qualifications and access well-paid professional jobs. C, a small number of people have a disproportionately large impact on the economy and other aspects of society, such as the effectiveness of government and the success of large businesses and small businesses. Maybe these people should be selected when they are young and given the best possible opportunity to maximize their potential. D, when groups of people are separated, they tend to be more negative about people in other groups. Maybe if children go to different types of schools, it contributes to this effect. Maybe this affects them in adult life as well as when they're at school. E, maybe some teachers become very good at teaching children who get high marks on the 11+ test, and other teachers become very good at teaching children who do not get high marks and find the sorts of things they do at school much more difficult. So maybe selection means that children are matched with the most appropriate teachers, and this maximizes learning for everyone. F, maybe some children do well learning traditional academic subjects like English literature, maths and science, history, geography. Maybe other children do better learning other things like performing arts, design, technology, and practical skills like woodwork and hairdressing. Maybe having different schools means children can be offered a different curriculum more effectively. These are all arguments that have been made in relation to selection at age 11. And indeed, they're arguments that have been made about selection at other ages too. So have a think about these arguments and decide which of them you think are arguments for selection and which of them you think are arguments against selection. Pause the video and consider that now. Okay, I'm going to assume that you've done that, and what I would like you to do next is to pause the video again, and this time I want you to rank the arguments by importance. Which of these arguments do you think is the most important one? Which do you think is the least important? This is not something that you can base on evidence. This is something that depends on your judgment about the purpose of the education system and indeed your views on society. So pause the video and make some decisions about how you would rank these by importance. Okay, I'm going to assume that you've done that. I'd like to note that I am opposed to selection at schools at at the age of 10 or 11. And I think that my opinion is evidence-based, but it's always difficult to be sure of this because, of course, it does depend on which of these arguments I think is most important and what I think the purpose of education is. But let's look at some of the evidence then. There are a number of good pieces of literature which you can access which explore the arguments around selection. The points that I am making at the moment are based on some things which were on the reading list. So Andrews, Hutchison and Jones 2016 and Sippett, Browning 2017. There's a nice entry on the Full Fact website about social mobility and grammar schools, and there are a number of other things, some on the reading list and some in the wider literature that you could look at if you want to explore this in more depth. Okay, so if we use free school meals as an indicator of socio-economic status, let me explain that. So free school meals is something that is offered to children from poorer backgrounds. It does depend on parents declaring their income, declaring that they meet the criteria, and there will be some parents who choose not to do that for all sorts of reasons. But as a general indicator in large data sets, free school meals is about the best indicator we have of whether a child comes from a poorer background, a disadvantaged background, or not. So we will use free school meals as an indicator of disadvantage, and socioeconomic status just means the financial situation of the family that that child comes from. So high socioeconomic status means that the family have a relatively high income, and that normally means that the parents in that family are educated to a relatively high level, although not always. And low socioeconomic status is the opposite of that. Okay, so if we use free school meals as an indicator of socioeconomic status, then it is clearly the case that a lot fewer free school meal children go to grammar schools than you would expect just by looking at the population data. The proportion of children who receive free school meals who go to grammar schools is much lower than the proportion of children who receive free school meals who go to other schools, comprehensive schools and secondary modern schools. Now, there are a number of reasons why that might be the case. Obviously, performance on something like the 11 plus test is very closely correlated with performance on IQ tests. And performance on IQ tests is very clearly heritable. That means that parents who score highly on IQ tests do tend to have children who also score highly on IQ tests. And there is evidence that is, so when it's heritable, that's evidence that correlation is due to genetic factors and not due to environmental factors. Okay, there is an awful lot that has been written and an awful lot that we could discuss about that. But you could make the argument that the reason why there are fewer children in receipt of free school meals at grammar schools is at least partly due to the heritability of IQ and its link to performance on the 11 plus test. However, if you control for prior attainment in school, it is still the case that fewer than expected children in receipt of free school meals go to grammar schools. So there does seem to be some evidence that selection using the 11 plus exam makes it more difficult than you would expect for free school meal children to go to grammar schools. However, the small number of children in receipt of free school meals who go to grammar schools, the evidence suggests that they do benefit from that. They appear to perform better in terms of academic qualifications than similar children who do not go to grammar schools, who go to comprehensive schools. Unpicking that data is very difficult. There are a lot of questions around it, but the evidence certainly points in that direction. It is also true, as far as we can tell, that the gap between children who are from disadvantaged backgrounds and children who are not from disadvantaged backgrounds, well, that gap, which we're calling here the disadvantage gap, that exists in all parts of the system right across the United Kingdom, not just in England. Whether the system is entirely comprehensive, so no selection at all at age 11, or whether there is significant selection in that area. However, by looking at the difference between the disadvantage gap in areas where there is no selection and the disadvantage gap in areas where there is a lot of selection, it does appear that the disadvantage gap is larger in the areas where there is selection into grammar and secondary modern schools. So that does suggest that selective system increases the disadvantage gap. Now, there is an element of speculation is probably the wrong word. there are a number of assumptions that have to be made in looking at that data. It's very complicated because children travel between areas, particularly into areas, in order to access grammar schools. And that makes it quite difficult to separate out selective and non-selective areas. But whenever that analysis has been done, it does seem to show that the disadvantage gap is larger in selective areas. It's also an international finding. The PISA study of children's performance on tests, which are set by the PISA organization. It compares outcomes across different countries, and it asks a range of questions of the children sitting the tests and the senior leaders of the schools that those children attend. And one of the findings from the PISA program is that where an education system is more selective, on average, the disadvantage gap is larger. And one more piece of evidence that's related to this is that in England, schools are inspected by an organisation called Ofsted, and Ofsted gives them ratings based on how good they think the school is. The ratings are outstanding, good, requires improvement, and inadequate. There is a big debate about how valid and reliable the Ofsted grading criteria is, but it does seem likely that schools that are graded outstanding and good are on average performing better than schools which are given grades of requires improvement and inadequate. And if we use that criteria, then in areas where the school quality is high, where the majority of schools are receiving higher Ofsted grades, then that tends to make the data on selection look worse. So there is some evidence that might be relevant to this debate, and we could explore the other arguments. This argument really is about disadvantage and the impact on the disadvantage gap, but we could look at the other arguments that were made on the previous slide and explore some of that evidence. We don't have time to do that now. This is perhaps, certainly I think this is the most important evidence, and it tends to be the evidence that is used by people who are against any additional selection or in favour of getting rid of the selection that still remains within the English education system. However, there's one more argument here that we haven't explored, and we will just have a look at it in a moment. But before we do that, we need to think about why it is that at the end of the Second World War there was this tripartite system that actually really only had two types of school in it, with 1/3 of children going to grammar schools and 2/3 of children going to secondary modern schools. And now when you look at the English education system, the overwhelming majority of schools are comprehensive schools, and there's only a very small proportion of schools which are selective at age 11 using the 11+ exam. Okay, and we describe this change as the comprehensive movement. It started, well, I guess it started before the Second World War, but it really gathered momentum through the 1960s and into the 1970s. And so by the 1980s, very few children were still going to schools where there was selection using the 11+ exam. And this happened because there was growing dissatisfaction with the grammar system. This is explored in a very accessible way in West 2016, A Short History of Comprehensive Education in England, which was a paper presentation rather than a published paper, but it's the best summary that I think you'll find of this change that happened in the English education system sort of through the 1960s and 1970s. So growing dissatisfaction with the grammar system. It was a gradual change. I've already mentioned some numbers. 1947, 38% of children were in grammars, but by 1980, only 5% of children were in grammars. But the key thing is that it was a gradual change. It wasn't directly imposed by central government, and there were some local authorities that did not change, and those are the most selective areas that are left in England now. The main areas are Kent, and Buckinghamshire, where there's an almost complete system of grammar schools and secondary moderns. But nearer to Southampton, there are a couple of grammar schools in Salisbury, and there are grammar schools in both Bournemouth and Poole. Although the wider surrounding areas of Wiltshire and Dorset, the schools in those areas are comprehensive. This was a gradual change. There was a lot of debate about it. There was some resistance to it, but the general trend was towards eliminating selection, apart from a few local authorities that resisted. But the actual ban on new grammar schools only came into place after that change had occurred. And there's never been a move from government to introduce a policy to force local authorities to get rid of remaining grammar schools. That ban on new grammars keeps coming up politically, and there's arguments about whether it should be kept or whether it should be ditched and new grammar schools should be allowed. There have been some changes in that under the current Conservative administration, but really it's just details. And actually, the English system as it stands now is mainly comprehensive, but with these little pockets of selection into grammar schools and secondary modern schools, but only in some areas. Does that mean there's no selection? Well, there's often some discussion of selection by stealth. So rather than selection using an 11 plus test, there are schools where house prices are higher in the catchment areas of those schools. There are faith schools where you have to be, for example, from a family of practicing Roman Catholics, so attending Roman Catholic Church in order to go to those schools. Some schools have uniforms which are expensive, and there's an argument that if a compulsory uniform is expensive, then that puts off more disadvantaged children. And there are schools with strict behaviour policies, and obviously some parents will be making choices about schools, will look at strict behaviour policies and may feel that those are not appropriate for their children, or they may not like the idea of those. And there's some suggestion that that drives an element of selection as well. However, you do need to be a bit careful about that, because there are schools with strict behaviour policies which have admissions policy which is designed, perhaps as well as it can be, to avoid selection by stealth. It's obviously a debatable argument there, but I would just like to point out that you have to be careful not to make assumptions about how the admissions policy works just based on whether or not the behaviour policy is strict. Governance of schools is complicated. Here is a list of different types of schools that you would find within the English education system, and we could split these into, the most sensible way of splitting these up would be into schools that charge fees and schools that are funded by taxation. So if we look at this list here, actually there's only two types of schools there which are funded through charging fees, and all the other types of schools there are funded by taxation. Okay, so on this list, public school and independent school are examples of schools that charge fees, and the others are all examples of schools that are funded by taxation. In the end, for this module, you are going to need to know about academies, but the other types of schools that are listed here are not going to be all that significant in the discussions for this module. Okay, let's look at that a little bit more. So when we look at independent schools, we might describe some independent schools as public schools. These are the ones that were set up as charities to educate poor boys a very long time ago and have since become some of the most expensive schools in the United Kingdom. Eton College is the most famous example. These are usually boarding schools, so the majority of the children will live at the school during term time, but there are other boarding schools which are not public schools. It is all very confusing and a messy system in lots of ways. When we talk about private schools, we mean all of the schools that charge fees, pretty much. So independent schools and private schools are effectively words that describe the same thing. But public schools is not all private schools, it's not all independent schools, it's a subset of the schools like Eton College, which have a particular sort of it's difficult to put my finger on exactly what it is that makes them public schools. Some of it is to do with their history, some of it is to do with their reputation, some of it is to do with the offer that they make to parents who are paying the fees. Okay, but public schools are it's like a subset of schools, and they're not funded by the government, which is a common misconception. Okay, and when we talk about fee-paying schools, we mean all of them as well. So independent schools, private schools, fee-paying schools, that really means the same thing. Some of those schools would be considered public schools, but some of them wouldn't. Some of them are boarding schools, but some of them are not. Many of them are selective. Many of them have an entrance exam, but some of them are not. Some of them, if you are able to pay the fees and perhaps meet one or two other criteria, then you would be offered a place. Some of them offer special provision. So there are independent schools which offer specialist provision for autistic children. There are I grew up near Edinburgh. There's a school in Edinburgh, the Royal School for the Blind, I think it's called, which is for children with visual impairment. So some of them offer special provision which isn't available in the same way within the state system. And so for parents who can afford the fees, that's an opportunity that they might want to take. Okay, right, so that's independent schools. That's schools where the school charges fees for parents. And then maintained schools are all of the schools which are funded by the government, funded from taxation, so there's no fees to pay at these schools. Originally, if we go back to 1870, then school boards were set up to manage these schools. But in 1902, that responsibility was transferred to local education authorities. So each area will have a local government, and up to 2010, part of that local government would be the local education authority, and they would be responsible for running all the maintained schools, or nearly all of the maintained schools in their area. Gradually, from about 1988 onwards, there were changes. Up until 1997, there was between 1988 and 1997, there was a Conservative government. Quite a lot of local authorities were Labour controlled. There was a feeling that some of the things that local education authorities were doing were not good policy. And one way round that was to change the funding mechanism so that funding came directly from the Department for Education, central government, to schools. And that meant that local authorities were kept out of the loop to some extent. So that started in 1988 with grant-maintained status, which ran on until 1998. So that's now into a Labour government. And Labour brought in the idea of academies. So these are a different way of directly funding schools from the government. Initially, these were sponsored academies, so struggling schools that were supported that changed their status and were supported by another organisation, which might be a local business or a university or some churches or various organisations that sponsored academies. And then that programme was extended after 2010. Free schools are academies which are set up as new schools by groups of people who want to set up a school and receive permission to do that. And converter academies are schools that are doing fine but are able to convert to academy status, so they're no longer related to any governance from the local authority. And we're now at the stage where a significant majority of secondary schools are academies of one sort or another, so are funded directly from central government, whereas at primary level the majority of schools are still within local authorities, although there are certainly a substantial number of academies in the primary sector as well. There has been policy to require all schools to convert to academy status, but that policy didn't last very long. So we're currently in a strange situation where there is more than one system for funding schools, and schools have made different decisions about whether they want to be part of their local authority or whether they want to be funded directly from the government. And there are a number of issues around that which will be explored later in this module. Right, the final thing to think about is the way in which funding has changed both before and after the change in government in 2010. This graph is from an organisation called the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which is a very well-respected organisation that does financial analysis related to the way public services run and various other things. This is their analysis of spending per pupil. So funding of schools in England is based on the number of pupils at the school. You get a certain amount of funding per pupil, and it varies depending on a whole stack of different criteria. But it makes sense to think of funding as funding per pupil. So this is not actually funding, this is spending, but they're very, very closely tied together. So this is spending per pupil in primary, which is the green line, and secondary, which is the dark line. In primary and secondary schools from 1978-79 up to the current time. Now, obviously, inflation means that you can't directly compare the actual number of pounds that were spent in schools at different times across this period. So all of these prices have been adjusted by the Institute for Fiscal Studies so that they are based on the value of the pound now. So you can see, looking at this, that from 1978-79 through to about 1997, 1999, there was a slow but sort of very steady increase in funding or spending per pupil in both primary and secondary schools. There's a bit of a lump in the secondary line, isn't there? But it was going up slowly during that period. That whole period was under Conservative governments. And then from 1997 through to 2010, you can see that there is a dramatic increase in the spending per pupil in primary and secondary schools. That's because the government substantially increased the funding over that period of time. You can see that from a period around about 2010, which is roughly where that funny wiggle is in the secondary line, that the funding was, it depends which line you look at, but it stops going up, and then in secondary schools it's going down, in primary schools it stays flat. So you can see that under Conservative governments, and if we do it like this, the blue areas are Conservative governments, the spending per pupil has either risen very slowly or actually fallen. And under Labour governments between 1997 and 2010, there's been a substantial increase in funding. That funding has largely been maintained, hasn't it? We're not back to the levels that were seen in 1997 and before, but certainly the experience in schools is that there was a period where funding was good, and it's been followed by a period when funding has felt much tighter. Right, okay, so here's some further reading. Gillard is the very extensive history of education in the United Kingdom, particularly in England, which is available online. There's pages and pages and pages of it, so anything that you want to look up, any period that you want to look up, there will be information about the way the system worked in that resource. It only goes up to 2018. But up to that point, it's enormously comprehensive. You might find the University of Bristol School of Education Handbook for Education Professionals, which is often called the Bristol Guide. You might find that really useful. It makes very little assumptions about what you already know about the education system in England, and it takes you through all of the different aspects of how the system works at the moment. There are two different references here. This is because the 2020 one is available as an ebook from the library. The 2023 one is available in the library, but only as a hard copy. And that's to do with issues from the publisher's end. That's not to do with our choices here at the university. The differences between 2020 and 2023 are not big enough to really matter. So if you want to access that online, then the 2020 version will be fine. And there's West 2016, which is an excellent short history of the changes that led to from a two-tier system in English education through to a comprehensive system. So you should certainly look at those, and then there's more extensive reading on the reading list for the module if you need to dig into any of this in more detail. Things that it would be really good to do would be to create a timeline of your own education up to the age of about 18. So that would match the period when children would normally be in school or college here in the UK. And then for each period in your education, as you went to different schools or the subjects that you were studying changed or other things changed about your experience of education, be nice to compare each period with both the current and the historic English system. Where's it the same? Where's it different? If you came through the English system yourself, then how does your experience compare with the system in other parts of England? So, for instance, if you went to a primary school, well, in some parts of the country, you would have gone to an infant school first and then to a junior school afterwards, covering Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2. There are parts of the country where there's still first schools, middle schools, and then high schools. There are some of those over in Dorset. So different people will have different experiences even within the English system. And in particular, did you go to an area that had a selective system? Did you do 11 plus? Did you go to a grammar school? Or did you go to part of the system where all the schools are comprehensive? If you're an international student, then how does your system compare to the English system? Is it more like one part of the English system or more like a different part? Where is it the same? Where is it different? And thinking about those things would be a really good idea. The next session that you do will be with Emma, and she's going to look at the government's programme of reforms since the publication of the Schools White Paper in 2010. So remember, 2010 was when there was that important change from a Labour government to a Conservative-led government, and it was that period from 2010 to 2014 when most of the changes that we're interested in this module took place, although some of them date from the Labour government before 2010, and there have been some developments since 2014 as well. Required reading for Emma's session is Sam Freeman's report on the Gove reforms. Sam Freeman was a special advisor working with Michael Gove in the Department for Education during the period 2010 to 2014, and in 2022 he reviewed the Gove reforms a decade later and considered what had worked, what didn't, and what might happen next. And you're asked to summarise the problems he identified with the current school system in England.